Okay, Lister, Tracy Novick here. I promised you all a budget video. So here's the story. One of the first comments that I saw after the press started picking up the fact that we were having a budget cut this week was someone saying something like, I thought you guys had all that money back in the spring. You had all those meetings about how we were going to spend it. Where'd that go? And that's actually exactly the right question. So way back in February, when we got our first presentation on the budget, after Governor Baker came out with his budget, House 2, there was a slide, which I can show you here, but then I also realized recently that you'll only see it backwards, but there was a slide in our presentation which demonstrated what would happen if we had a budget that didn't have the Student Opportunity Act funding in it. And that is what happened. So the governor presented his budget in January. Usually it then would roll through the legislature or the House, and then the Senate would each have budgets that they would propose and pass. And usually the governor's budget is the lowest of those, at least in terms of Chapter 78. Instead, what happened, of course, is coronavirus hit in March. The state budget process came to sort of a screeching halt, and the state passed just sort of a carryover budget before, in July, passing a budget that gets us through to October. The trick, though, is that that budget from July to October has in it state aid that only includes enrollment and inflation changes. It doesn't include any of the Student Opportunity Act implementation. And what that is exactly what was pictured here. So what that is because we had a drop in enrollment, that's actually a loss, a net loss of about a little over $4 million. The base foundation aid change because of inflation is essentially the rest of the increase. It was $7.7 million, but then you subtract the enrollment, it brings us down to more like 3. So that is essentially all of the Chapter 70 aid net out that we get in terms of an increase. So remembering also that a level service budget is a $14 million increase for the Worcester Public Schools. That is essentially more or less the gap that we're trying to make up here. So while that budget only gets us through to October, with every passing day and week, there's less of a chance for us to essentially kind of make up the difference. The state is clearly waiting on the Fed. The Fed, of course, the latest coronavirus aid bill is in the Senate. Senate leadership, as I mentioned before, sent everybody home until after Labor Day. So we won't see any action until September at the very earliest. Obviously, the state legislature is in particular hoping that something happens before the end of October. But we have to act now. We don't have any choice. So in order to make up this $14.5 million that we are suddenly lacking, the saving grace here from a budgetary perspective is that we are starting with remote learning, and that means that we don't have to get students to school, at least our students to school, which means that we can cut things from the transportation account. Keep in mind, as I think I've mentioned before, and any of you who've heard me talk about school budgets before know, most of our money in school districts goes to salaries. We have teachers, and we have custodians, and we have counselors, and a lot of them, and there's not a lot of other places in a budget to go to cut things. That's not because people are mean or terrible. That's because that's most of what we spend our money on. Because we are not rolling school buses until at least November, those are expenses that we can manage without. So keep in mind that every transportation cut is essentially teachers saved. So that's to the extent that there is any sort of saving grace in this, that's probably the saving grace. I know there was some concern about seeing salaries, the salary account at the top. That is not cutting current salaries of teaching staff. It doesn't impact any of the current contract. There is a cut to the extended day programs. They're also just rolling through here. The one place where there actually is position cuts is there is elimination and reallocation of instructional assistants. There also is a cut of the day-by-day account, but those are not positions. And then there's a couple of places where there's vacancy factors, which essentially means that there's positions that aren't currently filled that we essentially will be indicating that we're allowing to continue to go unfilled, including 5 positions that are actually in the facilities staff, which is also unfortunate, obviously. Otherwise, there's instructional materials, student furniture, in-state travel, which is how we pay for the people who move from building to building during the year, and there's even trash removal, because we will have fewer people in the building. One thing that we're being asked to keep an eye on, as I think you've probably heard me mention before, is because our school nutrition runs on a reimbursement on number of students fed, and our school nutrition has been for a number of years essentially self-funded from that, with fewer students being fed. That's substantially less money that's coming in from the federal government in reimbursement. So that's something that we're being told we also need to keep an eye on. So in terms of things that you can do, I will say that our legislative delegation is entirely on board with getting something done. So you could certainly cheer on, Senator Warren and Senator Markey. The House already did their job on this. Really, if you have any contacts in other states where they're in the party of the current leadership, those schools need that aid too. So that could be useful. And otherwise, we're essentially sort of sitting tight and waiting for the state, which is waiting for the Fed. So not good news, not as bad as it could be, although any place where you're making budgetary decisions that is eliminating people's salaries is not something that anybody ever wants to do. So that is where we are at. That is on the agenda for Thursday. It is part of a fairly significant agenda, and if you have any questions about process or how we got here, the one thing I do want to add, I know because Worcester casts a pretty big shadow, if you are in a different district, this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be doing the same thing. Worcester, as a city, based their budget on House 2. That is not a decision that every city or every town made. So just because we're doing this doesn't mean necessarily that you will. It would depend on what your Chapter 70 assumption was essentially going into your FY21 budget. So don't necessarily panic. Just because this is what we're doing doesn't mean that everybody is. As I said, if you've got questions on process, let me know. And otherwise, stay safe and stay in touch. And I will give you an update after Thursday. Thanks.